Yo, yo, yo! Welcome to another episode of Wired In with Apavelli. We are just going to talk about it today. Guess what we're going to talk about? We're going to talk about Windows Phone. Let's have a moment of silence for Windows Phone as I sip this coffee. Ah, man. Yes, so Tuesday, December 10th, marked the final day for Windows Mobile to receive security patches. Yeah, it was a long time coming. We kind of knew this day would come even years before Microsoft announced it last year, I think, or was it 2017? 2017 is when they announced that they were pretty much going to stop releasing devices, Windows Phone devices. And, you know, I was on Twitter, Instagram, and I see a lot of people, you know, a lot of devs in the Microsoft community, Microsoft enthusiasts, consumers. They were basically, you know, kind of sad, you know, because we all wanted Windows Phone to work. We wanted Windows Phone to be that third competitor. So, but it didn't happen. Still iOS and Android. I know a lot of people, you know, they're pretty much fixed on whether using an iOS or an Android device. Some people switch between the two operating systems, devices. But I always felt it was always good to have a third option. So I kind of want to talk about, I think I talked about how I became a Windows developer or a Microsoft developer on a previous episode, but I'm going to talk about how Windows Phone was actually my first smartphone. See, I was late in the game. Everybody had the first iPhone in 2007, the first Android device, I think, in 2008, 2009. You know, everybody would, you know, spending $1,000 a year to buy an iPhone. I had a simple cell phone, and I said, you know what? I don't need all this extra stuff. So eventually I said, you know what? I'm in California. You know, I might need to catch an Uber or taxi. I think Uber was just really starting to become, more popular around this time. So it was 2013. Yes, it was 2013. Or was it 2014? Oh man, was it 20? It was 2013. 2013. It was in the beginning. It was I want to say it was February. I said, you know what? I'm going to get a smartphone for once. I'm always late to the game. One thing about me, I don't get on the bandwagon. I don't like to, you know, if everyone has an iPhone, I don't want it. If everyone has an Android, I don't want it. I like to be different. I'm not better than anyone. I just don't like following crowds. I just like to really do what I want to do. So I remember I said, you know, I'm going to get a Windows Phone. You know, why not? No one talks about it. I want to be different. And I like the UI. I like the Metro style UI. So I said, you know, I'm going to get a Windows Phone. Now, I remember when I was buying my first Windows Phone, which was an HTC Windows Phone, and it was running Windows 8. So, the first Windows Phone, I believe, was released in 2010, Windows Phone 7. So, 3 years later, I get a Windows Phone, Windows 8, Windows Phone 8. And the guy, as I'm making the purchase, he's like, well, why are you buying a Windows Phone? I'm like, because I want to. He said, well, Windows Phone, there's no apps. There aren't any apps. Why don't you just get an iPhone or an Android? I said, nah, I don't want that. And I said, you know, I'm an app developer. Then he kind of eased up. He said, oh, okay, so you can make your own apps. And I said, yeah. So I purchased the Windows Phone. And I did notice that there was a big, huge app gap. I'm like, man. But as an app developer, I'm like, okay, I can create my own app. So if there's something that I need to use, I can build it myself. And then I also noticed, and I said, you know what? it does have a small market share. I think at the time it was like maybe 3-4%. And I said, you know what, this is still it's small, but there's millions of users using Windows phones. Not necessarily here in the US, but in Europe, in other markets, they were using Windows Phone. I said, you know, I'm just going to make Windows Phone apps. I'm not going to make an iPhone app because it costs a lot. Like, people don't realize when you make an iPhone app, when you get into iOS development, you have to have Apple devices. You have to compile the code on Apple devices. You have to update these devices. So you're spending thousands of dollars, and then you have to pay $100 a year. Now, I'm not saying like people shouldn't build iPhone apps, but for me at the time, it just wasn't really worth it. I couldn't really afford the $100 a year license fee. At the time, I was already publishing Android apps because I had a Nexus 7 tablet, so I would publish apps. It was $25 one-time fee. So with Microsoft, I think at the time it was $25, and I think it was yearly. Yeah, it was yearly. And then I think in 2014, it dropped to $19 one-time fee. So by the time I really got into Windows Phone development, to me, I thought it was perfect timing. So I get home and I open up Visual Studio, and I start kind of playing around with some of the tools. UWP wasn't around at the time. You could create universal apps, but it wasn't like universal Windows platform. So basically, you could create a Windows Phone app, and you can have a Windows runtime app to run on the desktop and tablets. So basically, you would have two projects into one. I really didn't focus too much on the runtime apps at the time because I really wasn't a huge fan of the Metro style design on the desktop, because I thought it was kind of silly to, have the Metro style where I didn't have a touch device. So I just didn't really care. So I didn't really think about it. So I just stuck with the phone, and I just started releasing Windows Phone apps. And the first Windows Phone app I created was the ratio analysis. And I believe there was a paid app, and I noticed people were actually buying the app. Simple calculator, people were buying the app. And I said, well, you know what? There's a need for apps in the Windows ecosystem, because a lot of users are willing to pay for it. They want more apps. And a lot of Microsoft users, they would always complain, hey, I'm going to leave because we don't have any apps. We don't have any apps. But there are some hardcore, indie app developers that I've met. They've created a lot of third-party apps for Windows Phone. I mean, I know there was an app gap. We didn't get the big apps like we didn't get iTunes or anything like that, or Apple Music. Well, Apple Music wasn't around at the time. Google Maps, Chrome, Gmail. They didn't release those apps on Windows Phone. I think that kind of hurt it, because a lot of users still use Google products on iOS, right? So they had a YouTube app on iOS. There was no YouTube app on Windows Phone. So you had a lot of developers create third-party applications, third-party YouTube applications. And, people are, it's not good. It's not made by Google. So that made me want to continue to create apps to develop for the platform, because I said, you know what? I'm a software engineer. If there's a problem, you need to solve it. And there's an app gap. So I said, you know what? Why would I go to crowded markets when there's an open market? And at the time, there was little growth in the usage of Windows Phone. So I said, hey, maybe eventually Microsoft would do well as far as marketing the product, and it could surpass Android. Might take a while, but maybe it could. I thought the acquisition of Nokia in 2014, I thought that was a step in the right direction. I'm like, cool, so great. So around 2015, what was it, 2014, late 2014, I think 2015, Windows 10 Mobile introduces UWP, Universal Windows Platform. So UWP, as you all know, you can write once and run on every Windows device. So if I write something for the phone, all I have to do is tweak the UI to run on the Xbox or PC tablet. I don't have to create 3 or 4 different projects. I thought that was a great concept, but UWP, people didn't really understand the framework. And when people think about UWP still to this day, they just think about Windows Phone. And it's like, dude, it doesn't say Universal Windows Phone. That's not what it stands for. It stands for Universal Windows Platform. So I was like, okay, maybe we're going somewhere with this. So I continued creating apps. I created several apps for Windows Phone. I unpublished a lot of my Windows Phone apps in 2017. Yeah, I started seeing a decrease in downloads for a lot of my apps. But I'll tell you some of my biggest apps on Windows Phone was Ratio Analysis, which was my first app. I created a game called Decades of Harmony, trivia game. That was a nice hit for me for a while. My Basketball Playbook is probably my most successful app on the platform, phone, desktop, Xbox. But my Basketball Playbook, as I mentioned before, started off as a Windows Phone app. And I made pretty good money off the app, to the point where I ported it to the desktop, to the tablet, to the Xbox. And it's still doing well to this day. Hold on, let me take a sip of coffee. Some good coffee, guys. Man, this McCafe Colombian coffee is really good. Side note, I make my own coffee at home, pour over method. Oh, it's the best way to make coffee. Anyway, back to what I was saying. My Basketball Playbook, Decades of Harmony. I released about at least 20 apps in the Windows Phone store. I can't even think of them right now. But I made money mostly through ads and some paid apps. Yeah, my Basketball Playbook is my most successful one though. So I can't think of any right now. I had simple apps too that were like, you can press a button and it'll give you like inspirational quotes and you can share them on social media. That was pretty popular. But most of my apps were popular in other markets, not even the United States. So mostly in Europe. I received downloads in like Brazil. Australia was a big market for me. Still is to this day, actually. So yeah, Windows Phone was good to me. Now, I will say I want to give a shout out to all the indie developers that contributed and made hundreds of apps for Windows Phone and tried to do their best to contribute to the platform, who were really passionate. I see a lot of developers still passionate developing UWP apps for Microsoft, and even though they're using Xamarin, to port to iOS and Android, they're still passionate about building for Windows. And I think it was a good run. It was a good learning experience. I learned a lot developing for Windows Phone, and what I learned from my success and failures, because I wouldn't say it was a total success or a total failure, is it taught me how to approach mobile app development on other platforms. It is not just about writing apps and writing code. It's mostly, how to market, how to understand, your users, On Windows Phone, I had users that would actually send me emails, and whether they liked the app or they didn't like the app, but me responding, I developed a relationship with them. And that inspired me and motivated me to create more apps. So it taught me to, hey, when you make an app, make sure you create like a feedback loop. Get feedback from your users. Study the different markets. When we think here in the United States, when we think about iOS and Android, we just think about the United States, domestically here, where we live, right? But you have to look at other markets. You have to look at what will work. How you market your app here might not work, let's say, in India. So you might not want to create the same ad that you create here in India. Different audience. So Windows Phone taught me to understand different markets, because most of my apps were downloaded in other markets. So I had to understand the audience. I had to really understand, okay, wow, these are the colors that they like. This is the kind of design. You have to cater to that. You have to research. Look at the population. Look what some of their interests are. Look at some of the problems you can help solve. I still apply that now as I move to other platforms. So I learned a lot as a Windows developer, and I don't know if I would have learned that on iOS and Android if I just would have stuck with those platforms, because it's so competitive. I just would have I got to get this app out. I got to get this app out. And I don't know if I would have thought about it on a global scale like I did with Windows Phone. So Windows Phone helped me become a better developer. And reaching out to other developers in the community who I still talk to this day, I'll ping some developers and say, hey, how's it going? What project are you working on? And it's just I'm really thankful for Windows Phone. I still have my Windows Phone. I'll use it, not as my main phone, but just something that I'll have for nostalgia, to look at. Some of the apps that I have made, I'm going to port over to Android and eventually iOS. And on web, PWAs. So it's been a great run. I do think Microsoft kind of dropped the ball with the marketing and not really convincing developers. I think Microsoft, they were so used to targeting enterprise customers. I don't think they really, one of the weak points is how to get to consumers. That's just my opinion. I'm sure people would argue, but that's what I've noticed. There's a lot of features in the Windows Phone that were stolen by Apple and Google and implemented on iOS and Android, and people was like, oh yeah, well, I can do this, and I'm like, well, yeah, I've done that on my Windows Phone like 2 years ago. Oh, see, Microsoft, they didn't talk about it. So, but one thing I can say that they did right is trying to be more interactive with developers. They do talk with developers. I do believe Microsoft is a developers first company. I just think with Windows Phone, I just think they were kind of learning as they go, and they were just a little too late. Maybe a year or two too late, maybe a couple months too late. And I think Windows should be in the place of Android right now, because I feel like Windows Phone, the operating system, was more superior than Android. And I like Android, and I've actually kind of turned my Android into a Microsoft device. I use Microsoft apps. I use Outlook. I use the Microsoft launcher. Kind of gives me that Windows Phone feel to it, in a sense. And Microsoft, they're releasing new devices next year. The Surface Neo, Surface Duo, which will run the Android operating system, the foldable device. Well, I don't think it's a phone. I don't think they call it a phone. It's a device that can make calls. That should be exciting for developers, especially the service devices that's running Windows 10 port some of the UWP apps and kind of change the architecture to handle dual screens. So that's exciting. So I think Microsoft is reinventing itself in the mobile space by just focusing on what they do best, providing services, software. They have a lot of apps in the Android store and iOS store, but Microsoft is really doing well in the Android store, which is pretty cool. And it's pretty cool how they kind of just embrace other platforms, and that I think will help developers even use their tools and maybe even build for Windows. Development has changed a lot since we started using smartphones, Windows Phone, iOS, Android. It's changed a lot. A lot of people are comfortable with their devices, so more devices are being released, created as we speak, and the way we compute is a lot different. And I think Microsoft, they realize that, and I think they're going to reinvent the way that we use PCs, because now pretty much what you can do on your phone, you can do on your PC now. You receive calls, you can text, you can finish, if you're working on something on a document, you can continue it on your phone. It's basically you don't ever have to pick up your phone, and I think that's really awesome. I don't know much about their iOS apps, even though I do have an iPhone and I have some of their apps, but they seem to really be more focused with Android because Android is more open source. So I like to say Windows Phone as we know it may not be here, but the spirit of Windows Phone still lives on. But I'll say Android has kind of helped it become Windroid, using Microsoft services on Android operating system. So if you're a Windows Phone user and you still, well, you kind of have to now choose a different phone. I mean, you can still use your Windows Phone, but you just won't receive security updates. Choose the platform that works for you. You know, I'm not going to say iOS is better than Android or Android is better than iOS. If you want simplicity, go with iOS. You know, it's a great phone. I don't use the iOS as my main phone. I have an iPhone 6 that I use for testing purposes, and so I can be familiar with the operating system in case I have to develop an app, so I can understand the UI and the design guidelines for that operating system. Then get iOS. If you want more control, more customization, Android is the right device for you. That's what works for me, especially as a developer. I already developed for Android, so I just feel like it's just the right choice. It's almost like the second best thing to a Windows phone, Windows operating system is Android. If you get the right Android device, that's the thing. So yeah, it's really been a great run. You know, I've met some cool people. I continue to meet cool other developers, and I just, you know, this is a farewell to Windows Phone, and you know, who knows, you know, Microsoft might develop some type of device to where, you know, Apple and Google might have to catch up. Microsoft is pretty much doing well in the cloud. Microsoft is really doing well at providing services to build on other platforms, and I think that's what that's what they're focused on. So much caffeine this morning, like I'm really wired right now. So yep, I think that's it for this episode. I just wanted to do a farewell and talk about Windows Phone, talk about my journey. You know, it's been a great run. I always like being the odd person, my core group of friends. Now, one thing I do want to mention, I actually had two friends that had a Windows Phone before me, and both would complain about apps. They loved the phone, but they would complain about there's not enough apps. So before I even received my Windows Phone, I had one friend tell me, you should make apps for Windows Phone. And at the time, I'm just like, yeah, whatever. But when I finally purchased a Windows Phone, I said, okay, yeah, I'm gonna start making apps. But by the time I purchased the Windows Phone, they moved on to iOS, so they pretty much sold out. But I just wanted to mention that point. But had they not mentioned Windows Phone, I don't know if I would have probably been a Windows Phone developer. Maybe. So now I am about to get off here and write some code. I am going to do something productive. I have a lot of projects that I'm working on. A lot of projects. I wish we had more than 24 hours in the day. But we don't, so I have to manage my time. So that's it. Follow me on Instagram at Apavelli. Follow me on Twitter at Apavelli. PragmaticDevSolutions.com, Apavelli.com. You can go to my YouTube channel, Apavelli. See some videos of my apps. You can also Wired In with Apavelli podcast. It's on YouTube as well. You can subscribe on YouTube. All it is just the audio. You can subscribe on iTunes, Spotify, Google Podcasts, wherever you listen to podcasts. It would be greatly appreciated. And it would be greatly appreciated if you took the time out your day to leave me a review on Apple Podcast. 5 stars. Please give me feedback. What do you want me to talk about? What do you want to hear? We have so many great podcasts that talks about software development, but there's always something that is missing, and I'm looking to fill that void. So what do you want to hear? What do you want to talk about? I'll tell you what we will talk about more. We'll talk about code. We'll talk about different software engineering methodologies. We'll talk about different technologies. We'll talk about different frameworks. We'll talk about the approach to running a software company. We'll continue to talk about these things. But give me feedback. Hit me up on social media. I'm begging you. I want to give you more content. So if you want me to give you more content, just ask. That's all I'm asking you to do. Thank you for listening. That's it.